We might make a start. My name's Paul Oslington. I'm Professor of Economics and Dean of Business. One shouldn't admit to any association with a business school in this place, I guess, but we're trying to be a bit of a different one. Alpha Crucis, if you haven't heard of it, it's an attempt by a few of us to start a Pentecostal Christian university in Parramatta. But the focus of this session is Australasian economics. So it connects up in some ways with the session that we had before lunch on the future of Australian economics. And I think this history of Australian economics now sets some of the background against which we discuss possible futures for the profession in Australia. So now, Alec, the focus of this, I guess the material that we're using to begin this discussion about the history of Australian economics is the book which Alex has written, which he will hold up and wave and happily sell you a copy with a 20% discount after the session if you're interested. So Alex's book, he's going to speak for 30 minutes, no more than 30 minutes on his book and on the history of Australasian economics, and then we're going to have a discussion assisted by two eminent panellists who I'll introduce when they come up later on the history of Australasian economics. So I'll introduce Alex and then we can move quickly on to him without any more from me. So Alex is Associate Professor of Economics at Federation University. Now Alex has been writing on this topic for some years. He's written, for those of you who are interested, a very I think, important paper on the history of this conference, ACE. He's written bits on the history of the Economic Society, but this book, which he's going to speak about, pulls it all together. And the most important thing about Alex, which I shouldn't miss, is that Alex is the president of the History of Economic Thought Society of Australia. So, Alex, over to you. As well as being a good guy, of course, he's president of the History of Economic Thought Society of Australia.
Oh, how do we get to the paper?
Probably page down.
Right, so
I think if you then
you click on
click on that, you'll get to it, Alex.
Right. Okay, ladies and gentlemen, thanks for coming. Now, let me open with a crass bit of commercialism. Routledge tells me that I've sold 58 copies of this book. What I didn't tell them is that I've bought 10 copies. And the idea is that I'm not going to do any arbitrage pricing. I'm going to charge $150. They're charging $160. I'll also throw in a signature. If you want to buy the book, I've got 8 copies here. I don't want to take them back to Melbourne. It would be a bit like, going out and then coming back with the tail between your legs. He's sort of coming back to Melbourne, with the books. Oh, yeah, a successful mission. So if you want to buy the book, I can let it go for $150. It actually cost me $160, so I'm actually a net loser here. 3 years ago, I was sitting at home, and an interesting little email came from Routledge, from a publisher there, and saying, "Dear Alex, would you like to write a book on a history of Australian economics?" And I don't get many book proposals, and this was certainly something that pricked my interest. That was 3 years ago, and then Brendan, what happened then was that I said, "All right, let me think about it," and I was very excited by it, actually, to write a book instead of journal articles or newspaper articles. So I drew up a book proposal, and John Ludwig's one of our speakers. He was one of the referees, and a chap in New Zealand, Tony Andres, was the other referee, and John was pretty supportive. Tony was a little bit apprehensive that I was trying to do too much, because what I wanted to cover was a history of Australian but also New Zealand economists in the 20th century, and I also wanted to look at public sector economists, like bureaucrat economists in the public service, in the Treasury, And Tony Andres said I was stretching it too far and that the end product would become potted. I didn't really want to do New Zealand economics either because I didn't know much about New Zealand. I did live there for a while as a child, and I can remember it was a rather dark and dingy place. And all I knew about New Zealand is that they're very good at econometrics, New Zealand economists. But Routledge insisted, no, it's got to be Australasian, right? And not Australia or New Zealand, but Australasian. So in September of 2014, John and Tony Andres from Auckland University said, well, let's go ahead with it. And so I started to write. Remember, I had some prehistory, as Paul said. I'd written quite a bit about leading Australian economists, and I'd written about the history of the Conference of Economists. I'm a weird creature. I've been coming to Conference of Economists since 1979. The first one I remember was when Bruce Littleboy was at UQ. He's still there, and he was just doing a PhD on Keynes and Legendhufford. So I'm one of these conference tragics. I like to come to conferences. It's a medical affliction, and there's no cure for it. Anyway, getting back to the book. So I started writing. 100,000 words was the quota. And I thought, well, how am I going to write this? Because I wanted to basically cover three things. I wanted to do leading Australian New Zealand economists. I wanted to write about the profession, the rise of the economics profession in both countries, and also against the backdrop of the economic circumstances, the 20th century economic experiences of both Australia and New Zealand. Now, by the way, I'm Scottish, but I've been in Australia since 1964. It's just I can't get rid of this accent. You know, every time I leave it on the train or the tram, people say, "Oh, you've forgotten your accent," so I've got to go get my accent back. Anyway, that's a joke. But so I knew quite a bit about Australian economics. Went to Monash, and then I did a PhD at the ANU on the origins of macroeconomic management, the rise of Keynesianism in Australia in the late 1930s. Anyway, so I took on the brief, and writing a book was a bit exclusive. You know, I couldn't do anything else. I had to stop writing newspaper articles. Funny thing about that is when I tried to flog this book on the newspaper, they don't want to take my copy anymore. So there's a bit of a sacrifice there. I seem to have lost my journalistic touch. I tried to flog this. I tried to talk about the book and couldn't get anything in the Age or the Canberra Times or even the Fin Review. So anyway, that's the price to pay. But anyway, so there was a book before this, of course, a fairly interesting book by Peter Groenewegen and Bruce McFarlane. They're both alive. And they basically covered Australian economics, but as I said in the last paragraph, it was mostly on the 19th century and also on political economy and ratbags and mavericks and dilettantes, etc. And I decided, no, I'll start in 1925 when the Economic Society of Australia was founded. So I used Economic Society as my platform. And by the way, I should actually give the Economic Society a bow of gratitude because they gave me some money. Not much, but they gave me some money at something. And also thank Paul for organizing this session, by the way. And also John. Actually, John should be also credited because he actually proofread the final version. So any mistakes are linked to John, okay? Any mistakes, he's responsible. He's a busy man, but he took time out to read the final proof, the electronic proof. And there was even some errors in that. And William, of course, who's organizing the History of Economics conference at Canberra in late September. Anyway, the Groenewegen-McFarlane book had mediocre appraisal, you know, it was good in parts, uneven, etc., but a bit warped. So, but I don't think that's why Routledge wanted me to write it. But one interesting finding out of the Groenewegen-McFarlane book was that they suggested that was published in 1990. They suggested that Australian economics faced the fatal embrace of the Americanization of economics. That was a controversial finding then, but today it's basically a fait accompli. You might call it internationalization. William himself has written about Australian economics, and he said that there is no Australian economics anymore. In fact, I've quoted William to that effect. Now, internationalization rules. So, and the thing that I'm on about, if you came to the last session, we can talk about the fatal embrace of American economics, but what about the fatal embrace of your business schools, which are just about everywhere. As I said in that last session, Monash, which used to be a faculty of economics and commerce, now wants to call itself a Monash business school, and they actually say that their vintage goes back to 1962, which is in fact not correct. John's written about the impact of business schools, as I've written also a little bit about it, and the problem of student disinterest, etc. Anyway, as I said, I didn't want to write about New Zealand, but I had to. But I used the Economic Society of Australia and New Zealand, which was founded in 1925, and it was the first trans-Tasman organisation in the sciences, linking the two academic communities. The thing about New Zealand then in the 20s is that the economic profession was absolutely minute, right? And I wanted to focus upon a problem-specific approach, looking at Australian or New Zealand economic issues, because that's what these economists were writing about, okay, from 1925 onwards. But when I came to actually writing the book, which was an intimidating prospect, I decided to do what I'm best at, which is to focus upon economists as interesting people, and you know, they were interesting people. Less on doctrine, so it was going to be lightly written, this book. It was going to be sort of, you know, enticing, you know, where you picked it up and you couldn't put it down. Someone has said that to me. They said that it's an enticing read. And how economists interacted with each other, using correspondence. I've accessed all the archives in Australia and in New Zealand to write this story about the rise of the economic profession in both Australia and New Zealand, and of course the development towards economics doctrine. And as I said, some of these archives were untapped. Some I had already visited before and I'd taken copious notes. There are marvellous archives in Melbourne, particularly at the University of Melbourne, and also Adelaide, and of course the National Library of Australia has got lots of archival material. One thing where Australia actually excels at is they have a tremendous archival resources of leading Australian economists. New Zealand, not so many, very few. I couldn't find much about New Zealand economists. They obviously don't seem to collect their greats. You know, they don't seem to, libraries, the university libraries don't seem to collect the correspondence or the papers of the previous great economists that were their universities. I wanted to, in the opening page, I want to bring out the passing parade of economists. I read it with a certain melancholy air, because I wanted to say, look, who remembers this economist? You know, or that economist. So I was writing it in a sort of a Celtic melancholy a little bit, because it's a work of history, and I wanted to remind people about Australia's illustrious past in economics, and also New Zealand. Okay, and I would talk not just about the greats like Colin Clark and Heinz Arndt and Trevor Swan and the Butlin brothers, but also lesser mortals, you know, people that never got a Guernsey, some mad people, heretics. I'm currently writing a book on a huge heretic called Colin Clark. So this is the sequel to this one. So it's a 20th century story. The actual economists were mostly Anglo-Saxon, right? There was no multi-ethnic society then. It was very Anglo, okay? And a lot of English economists or people went to England to do their economics, whereas today, of course, you go to America. And Max Corden reminded me of, Max was one of the people I would talk about. He said, well, even though Australia and New Zealand are at the edge of the world, great ideas and great works can sometimes come from the periphery. Let me just give you one example. Karl Popper wrote The Open Society and Its Enemies at the edge of the world in Christchurch, New Zealand during the war. I think he was a refugee from the Nazis. So great ideas can come from down under. Okay, and that was the other thing I wanted to talk about in this book. You know, that, you know, we have made our contribution. We have punched above our weight, both Australia and New Zealand. Harry Johnson in 1971 said that basically Australian economics is derivative, and William's written about this. a long and respectable tradition, but no great innovations, more applied, etc. Not a flattering comment. But in the 60s and the 70s, when I started to do economics, Australian economists were well renowned for trade and for labour economics, and for looking at the economics of a small open country with centralised wage determination, etc. And people like Max Corden and Richard Snape and Joe Isaac and countless others, they wanted to make a difference to Australia. They had a practical policy focus, and they did. And I start off in 1925, and that was a very prolific period when Australian economics actually flourished, because we had the Brigden Report on tariff protection, Giblin's export multiplier, fiscal federalism, and then just after the Second World War, trade expansionism, trying to achieve full employment by open borders. The Premier's Plan, which I wrote about in 1931 in my PhD, which, even though it was fairly deflationary, Keynes himself said it had saved the Australian economy from liquidation. And then after the war, you had people like Coombs leading this post-war crusade to promote full employment. It was called the positive or the employment approach. And then in the 1970s, much closer to home, Australian economists, trade economists, pushing that we should open up our economy. We did have a terrible degree of protection and tariff protection, even import licensing at one stage. But Australian economists, academic economists, led that fight, I would say, in pushing Australia towards open markets. That's probably the great recognition, the great achievement of Australian economists in this generation. So it was a brilliant start with the formation of the ESANZ, that's the Economic Society of Australia and New Zealand, and then you had some praise there from D.H. Robertson, a Cambridge economist, saying that there was this country down south called Australia where economists, academic economists that is, were listened to, okay? And there was another country called Sweden. And at one stage we were called a practical utopia. The person I'm writing at present, Colin Clark, when he came out to Australia on a visiting lectureship for a year, and he decided that there was more potential here to do good than to go back to Cambridge and work as Keynes' statistical genius. So he turned his back on Cambridge. He was offered a job in Queensland, working in the Queensland Public Service. But to turn his back on Cambridge and a job as a lecturer of statistics and working with Keynes and all the other greats at Cambridge was quite a big decision for him to make. It might well have been the salary he was offered, but he decided that he was going to settle in Australia. And in fact, he actually started to call himself an Australian. Actually said, "Oh, my father was an Australian," which is not correct. Anyway, and that's what I'm currently working on at present. The coverage of the book, then, I had to figure, well, who should I cover? Well, I'll cover some of the leading greats, right? But not also some of the lesser mortals. And I also have to cover immigrant economists like Clark and Heinz Arndt and Harsani, who was a game theorist up at the University of Queensland and University of Sydney. And then he decided to go back. He went to America. He was a Hungarian refugee. As I said, one of the problems in writing this book was the paucity of primary references for New Zealand economists. I mean, the Association of New Zealand Economists, which was formed in '65, I don't think they have any archival records. So I never went over to look at them because they never answered me. Whereas the Economic Society, the Victorian branch, has got a huge amount of records down in Melbourne, University of Melbourne, in the Downing papers, the press papers, and they've also got their own file. So there's plenty of material to write about Australian economists or Australian issues, the history of the society. In fact, we also have a history of the society. It was written by R.H. Scott. So there's plenty of material here. But for New Zealand, it was very frustrating, very frustrating. And in fact, it caused lots of sleepless nights. In terms of possible subjects, well, I could obviously cover the distinguished fellows of the Economic Society, and there's an appendix in the back of the book where I list all the members, and the same for New Zealand, and there's some names there. Now, what I had to do, though, is I couldn't write about Australian or New Zealand economists that had gone off overseas to fulfill their career or to develop their career. So people like Tarnowski, Macmillan, Meek, Lancaster, quite a number of famous Australian economists that went overseas and maybe never returned. So I decided to make it domestic residency, a domestic residency criterion, that you had to basically be based in Australia and New Zealand and make your contribution here. I made one exception for A.W. Phillips, Bill Phillips, because his Moniac machine was actually financed by New Zealand money. His parents, and then he had a New Zealand government study grant. So the Moniac machine, which is this hydraulic computer before electronic modeling, was actually a New Zealand invention, even though New Zealand no longer they have an electronic version on the RBA of New Zealand. The Reserve Bank of New Zealand got an electronic version of it. The Phillips curve, I mention that because Phillips actually came out to Australia in 1958 to do an Australian Phillips curve, and that was sponsored by our friends at the Reserve Bank. So I made an exception for Phillips. I also covered some economists that are under the Academy of Social Sciences. As I said, I used the Society as a platform for the study in the Victorian branch, which was the first one established, and that's where probably the main ideas for the Premier's Plan, Copeland and Giblin, came from. Douglas Copeland, who I've written quite a bit on, he was described by Max Corden as the George Washington of Australian economics. We probably need a Copeland today, I think, to revive or to make Australian economics come back again. Giblin, of course, the grand old man of Australian economics, one of the great theorists, perhaps. The Economic Record, which had a Melbourne vintage for the first 50 years, that is, the editorial staff was based down in Melbourne until about the mid-70s. I had to also look at people who might come to Australia as visitors, and Australia's had plenty of visitors, like Benham, Niemeyer, Gregory, Redaway, Robinson, Caldwell, and people like that, and what they might have said about Australian economics. Usually didn't say that much. So what's some of the grand themes of the book then? As I said, I wanted to look at university economics, academic boffins. So my book disagrees with the Hines-Arndt, Max Corden line that post-war Australian economic policy was largely guided by bureaucrats like Wilson and Coombs, etc. In New Zealand, it's a different story. I think their economic transformation in the 1990s seemed to be led by the Reserve Bank and the Treasury over there, not the university boffins. Something else that came through, which is not an original point, was that each generation of economists always felt threatened by the rising young Turks, the more mathematical, more technical, sophisticated. And so when Hines-Arndt and Richard Downing were editing the Economic Record in the 50s and the 60s up to the mid-70s, they always found it hard to deal with technical articles, and they used to sort of handball them to someone else to have a look at. The other thing that came through in the book is that in the 60s, right in the post-war era, right up to about the 70s, there was a lot of amateurville stuff, indolence and provincialism, lucky gyms. Professors weren't expected to publish that much. The Economic Record was regarded as a fairly closed shop right up to the mid-70s, or mid-60s at least. The contending journal, the Australian Economic Papers, came into formation in 1962 to be an outlet for young economists. There seemed to, in the 1974-75 period, I seemed to detect, reading the Downing papers and some other papers, that there was something of a palace revolt within the citadel of the Economic Record, basically to go towards much more quantification, much more sophisticated articles, and less, favors as, a professor would send the paper and it would be automatically published. There seemed to be something of a palace revolt in the mid-70s in Australia, where the Economic Record became much more professional. The other thing, of course, is the decline of academic influence, which is a much more latter thing with the rise of market economists, etc. But I regard that as a natural development. I asked the provocative question in the last line here: will the Economic Society make its 100th birthday in 2025? I suspect it probably will, but most of the people attending will not be academics. They'll be public sector and private sector economists. As I said, I wrote the book with economic society always in my background, and the fates of the economic society. You know, I stop at 2000 when the economic society turned 75, but funny enough, they didn't have a 75th birthday party. Some other grand themes that come out of the book is a similarity between the two countries. That's why Routledge wanted me to focus upon the two countries, etc. New Zealand, though, I've got to tell you this, New Zealand's probably had a much more rockier ride in terms of economic experimentation, probably like Soviet Russia in the 20th century, with, you know, socialization in the mid-30s, insulation in the post-war period, and then, you know, the fortress New Zealand economy right up to about the mid-1980s, and then a complete overhaul. I mean, it's a very dramatic history, New Zealand, much more dramatic than us. The thing about New Zealand which really annoyed me was it was very hard to disentangle if there was any sort of impact of Keynesian ideas there. There was so little material to pick up on. So my commentary on New Zealand and its acceptance of the Keynesian economics or the adoption is very sketchy. I couldn't find anything. Whereas in Australia, I devote a whole chapter on Australia and the adoption of Keynesian economics and the post-war period. As regards New Zealand transformation, again, I didn't really want to get into that too much because it's still ongoing and it's still too early to form opinions, but it seemed to me, though, that it was more driven by the public sector, by the Reserve Bank and the Treasury, more than it was by academics. Academics seem to be lagging behind. It's a very difficult area to talk about because there's a lot of noise and it's incoherent and it's still quite recent. And there's a lot of politics. The antics of Robert Muldoon, for instance, are absolutely incredible. Piggy Muldoon, as he was called, the New Zealand Prime Minister, who dominated economic policy for about 20-odd years, right up to 1984. And then in 1983, we come to the official end, the burial of the ESANZ. What happened was that New Zealand economists in the mid-60s decided to form their own association and their own journal called New Zealand Economic Papers. But some branches of the Economic Society still existed there, but then in 1983 the last one died. And so New Zealand went its own way. The ESANZ came to an end. And the funny thing about that, it occurred at the same year that Australia and New Zealand had signed a closer economic relationship pact. There's lots of cross-fertilization where Australian economists went to New Zealand and vice versa, but it was more the other way, that New Zealand economists would go to Australia where the prospects, the career prospects were much larger, the academic discipline was much larger, the critical core, etc. The New Zealand economic profession right up to the 60s was just too small, minute. And if you were any good, you would go overseas, which is what a lot of New Zealand economists did. Some lesser themes, the Department of Bruce is referring to the macho, not the macho, the male dominance, you know, the lack of female economists until, you know, quite recently. The second line about theorists, well, you know, Australia's had a couple of grand theorists like Trevor Swan and Clark, maybe even, well, I mentioned a few coming in the last page, so. But not Copeland. Copeland was more a builder. There's been lots of builders over the Australian economic profession. Coombs was a great builder. Now, Coombs was the governor of the Reserve Bank. I tried to write it in a fairly light vein, not boring doctrinal history. So I had to sort of make it, you know rich with irony and humor a little bit, if there's any humor, you know, light touch. And always looking at the economies of both countries and the policy issues at the time. So that's how I wrote it, right? And whether that's a good approach, I don't know, but that's what I'm good at, so that's the approach I adopted. To just ask one last question, just how influential was academic opinion? And the book is basically that first line, the interplay of economic ideas and policy. Certainly Australian economists were much more influential than their New Zealand counterparts. But of course, we know that policy is guided more by events and circumstances and pragmatism than just academic ideas. Keynes' 25-year rule about, it takes 25 years for an idea to actually germinate, etc. For instance, just one example there, in the mid-70s, I'm a beneficiary of free university education. But I do remember people like Colin Clark and Michael Porter and Snape saying that the free tertiary university was an income transfer from the working classes to the well-off middle classes. And eventually, Australian policymakers, eventually we responded to that by bringing in the HEC system in 1988, Dawkins and Bruce Chapman. So again, we had our economists have been influential in changing policy. As regards the $64,000 question, who are Australia's greatest economic theorists? Well, Giblin and Swan, Harcourt, Corden, Kemp, who's somewhat forgotten. He's not even a member of the Academy of Social Sciences. Colin Clark, who I'm currently writing upon, an intriguing character, and maybe even Garneau. For New Zealand, there's names there that you probably won't recognize, but A.W. Phillips probably should have got a gong or some sort of recognition. I'll talk about him in a minute. Tarnowski, who's extremely prolific, but again, they did most of their work overseas. I wanted to look at New Zealand economists that actually were there or kept going back. And then just lastly, I'm using a line here from Monty Python from the Life of Brian. What have the Romans ever done for us? Well, what's Australasian economics ever done for us? Well, here's some of the contributions. HEX, inflation targeting, the 25% rule that Colin Clark came up with when he was in Queensland, the GDP, which was another one of Colin Clark's inventions, the multiplier of Giblin, effective rate of protection, Corden mostly, import licensing practice to a Byzantine degree, fiscal federalism, we've got a gong for that, macro stabilization, and of course centralized wage determination when you've got a small open economy and fluctuating terms of trade. And then lastly, Medicare, immigration, Glenn Withers maybe, trade practices, pharmaceutical benefit scheme, competition policy, the tariff board, which was a direct link, and the tariff board became the Productivity Commission. That was basically Corden writ large. And John Quiggins talked about the mixed fruits of privatization. Let me just finish on two quick vignettes, which I didn't put in the book, which is very annoying. The first one is about Colin Clark. 30 years ago, Colin Clark and Trevor Swan were given the inaugural Distinguished Fellow Award at the 1987 conference. Now, I was always under the impression that Colin Clark never turned up to that conference because he was ill. Someone told me very recently that he did in fact turn up, and the person presenting the gong was one Bob Hawke, Prime Minister of Australia. Now, Clark and Hawke had a history. When Hawke went to Oxford in 1952, Clark said, you don't know anything about economics, and you might want to do a thesis about Australia's wage arbitration system, but it's of no interest to me. It's of no interest to Oxford University. And so Hawke and Clark really fell out. Well, they fell out over that. And there was a degree of animus between the two men, even in the 60s. And here we have this rather awkward presentation in 1987 when Clark and Hawke had to meet, an awkward encounter, you might call it, which will be in my next book. The second vignette is about Phillips. Phillips always wanted to come back to Australasia. He was in grimy London working at the LSE, but he felt that his work there was more important. But he always pined for Australia and New Zealand. He eventually came back to Australia in 1967, and he got a job as a professor there at the ANU. He had a stroke, and he retired from the ANU in 1970. He sort of seemed to sneak back into New Zealand, and yet there he was in semi-retirement. And then either his granddaughter or his grandniece was doing an Economics 101 class, and they put up the Phillips curve, and she said, my uncle or my grandfather invented that. And the instructor then informed Auckland University, do you know that A.W. Phillips is back in New Zealand? So Phillips came back into academia just for a year and a half. Those are two little vignettes that are not in the book. Since I've wrote the book, I've discovered one error in the book, very minor. But the other thing is, of course, you think, oh, why didn't I put that in? Or why didn't I talk about that person? I mean, yesterday I was at the Glenn Withers thing, and he made a reference to a paper that I probably should have put in by two Australian economists. But, you know, the thing's written now and I can't change it. I'll finish now on one last point. When I got my PhD from ANU in 2004, I got 3 referees reports, and I distinctly remember reading these reports shaking with excitement and tension. I feel a little bit that way now with William Coleman and John Ludowicz about to unleash salvos. So I'll leave you with that. Thanks.
As I said earlier, we've got 2 distinguished and knowledgeable panellists to discuss Alex's book. So first up is Professor John Ludowicz, who's Professor of Economics and now, I understand, Vice President at SP Jain Global School of Management. So John has written widely on the history of econometrics, the history of development economics, quite a bit on the history of Australian economics, among a wide range of more general topics. So John is a real expert, and welcome.
Thanks, Paul. I think it's very opportune that you've organised a session on Australasian economic thought. Of course, the majestic treatment of Australian economic thought was by a guy called Crawford Goodwin, an outstanding man, a wonderful scholar, my PhD supervisor, and I can sadly say he passed away earlier this year. But maybe in a way we remember him. His name is mentioned elsewhere in the program for his outstanding contributions. I'd like to congratulate Alex on this very valuable book. I certainly have enjoyed reading it. It's a very valuable contribution. But Alex has always been provocative at many of the talks that he's given. So I think it would be remiss of me not to be provocative. He'd be very disappointed if I simply said wonderful things about his book all the time. So I'll try to be a little provocative in my observations of the book. First of all, I think he cheated me. He finished the book in the year 2000. Okay, Alex has written so much valuable stuff about the economics profession since 2000 that I was really waiting for that final chapter, which would encapsulate all that he's written on that. But the book finished in the year 2000. That's not a criticism. I can understand you need to have a cut-off date and you want it some time in the past to get a more objective assessment of what's been happening. But Alex has written so much on this material, I would have loved to have read that final chapter. What do I see is his main contribution? Well, his main contribution I see is his incorporation of New Zealand economists. He may have been dragged kicking and screaming into writing about them, but he's done a wonderful job. It's a great asset to now have their contributions included. So that's one of the main positives from the book that I really appreciate, as well as his focus on the economic societies and their histories. Okay, the key question we want to ask, though, is this is the third book. We started off with Crawford Goodwin's book. Well, he actually had 2. Then we had Groenewegen and McFarlane, and now we have Milmo. First of all, how do they compare? Well, I'm sure I'm very biased, given the fact that Crawford was my supervisor, but in my view, he set the standard. He absolutely set the standard in quality of history of economics. Groenewegen, McFarlane, and even Milmo, they're mere mortals in comparison. So having said that, what does Milmo add that Goodwin didn't, that Groenewegen and McFarlane didn't? Well, I've already mentioned New Zealand and its contribution, which is very valuable. But in my view, this book has been falsely titled. When I read it, it's a history of Australasian economic policy. It's a history of economic policy rather than the history of economic thought, which makes it no less valuable, no less useful. It's wonderful to have a history of economic policy, but in my mind, it's not a history of economic thought. That doesn't matter. It's still a very valuable book. So what really matters to Alex in this book is the influence that academic and non-academic research and economists have had on economic policy. That's his focus, economic policy. And because that's the focus of his book, it leads to certain features and characteristics of the book. It means that the period he covers could have been written in many different ways with a different focus. But because he focuses on policy, it has certain implications. For example, his treatment of Murray Kemp. His treatment of Murray Kemp is very brief, I think. Yet, you could write a very different book on the history of Australian economics where Murray may get star billing. Murray Kemp, of course, he put economics at UNSW on the map. No one had heard of UNSW economics until Murray came along. Murray made absolutely fundamental contributions in international trade theory. Samuelson at MIT was just glowing about Murray Kemp. And he certainly had the chance to stay at MIT. He probably would have got a Nobel Prize without a problem in the world, but he didn't stay at MIT. He came to little old UNSW, wasn't even called a university in those days, in Kensington. International trade theorists, some of the top international trade theorists in the world will tell you they'll be in total admiration for what Murray Kemp did to international trade theory. Some of them, and they've told me this, they built their whole careers, their reputations on the hints that Murray Kemp provided in his articles, or they've extended his work in various areas. So one could put Murray Kemp at the centre of some of this discussion, but because he was a theorist and he didn't do much about policy at all, not in the mature part of his career, he doesn't get much of a mention. But if the focus is policy, that's perfectly understandable, okay? Secondly, as Alex has mentioned, he didn't talk much about the contributions of Australians that went overseas. Again, you could write this very differently. I would have written a great deal about Kelvin Lancaster. I mean, he was the co-author of the theory of the second best. He did all that work on characteristics for consumer behaviour. He was publishing in the JPE. He had a very distinguished career at Columbia University. But again, because he did the bulk of his work overseas, Alex made the judgment that no, he was going to concentrate on contributions made in Australia. The third characteristic is Alex focuses very extensively on the Economic Record, which is our premier economics journal, and not so much the top 10 international economics journals. We all know what journals they are, and you could have gone through those journals and looked at, well, how many Australians published in these top journals? You know, the AER, the Quarterly Journal, Journal of Political Economy, etc. But because of his particular focus and approach, Economic Record was the basis. Okay, the next question to ask is, if the focus was on economic policy, and it was it broad-ranging, was it comprehensive, did it give equal treatment to the various different policy dimensions, economic policy dimensions? And I think when you read the book, there's a very large focus on macro management, understandably, because that's in the media all the time. There's I was really happy to see some focus on agricultural economics. That was also very useful. But I wondered if an equal amount of attention might have been given to environmental and natural resource economics, where Australians have made wonderful contributions. Clem Tisdall was mentioned, but he's just been phenomenal in that area. I wondered if there could have been a bit more on competition policy. Even someone like Alan Fells deserved a jersey, I thought, in more detail, and much more on micro reform and deregulation in Australia. So in terms of the balance there, I know there's only so much you can do, that one person can do, but we could look at the balance. The final issue what I want to talk about is how the book was researched and written. Some chapters are very short, some chapters are very long, and that reflects Alex's own contributions. In areas that he's written extensively, which is a lot of areas, the chapters dealing with that are very long. In other areas, the treatment is very brief, and it just reflects Alex's own research productivity, his own research interests. Another issue that I found a little disconcerting, and I'll be interested in someone like Bruce Chapman responding to this, it is very Melbourne-centric. It gives one the impression that Melbourne has been, still is, the centre of Australian economics. Now, as someone that comes from Sydney, I have a little trouble with that. But reading the book, you do get that impression that anything of any significance that happened in Australian economic policy came out of Melbourne. I may be exaggerating it a bit, obviously, that he talks about Adelaide as well, but I wonder if the other states might have been given a little more attention, and whether, because he's based in Victoria, because he had access to files there, archives there, that it might have slanted the treatment a little bit. And that's something that he might want to respond to. But you do really get the impression, if it wasn't for Melbourne, there'd hardly be any economic policy in this country. Okay, the other thing that is interesting is that when you write something like this, you have access to living economists, old in the tooth, who can comment directly on particular episodes in Australian economic policy. And one of the issues that crops up then is that whether it's because of human nature, whether it's self-conscious or whether it's deliberate, some people have a tendency to over-exaggerate their own impact on the course of history. They tend to believe in their own, maybe they're trying to rewrite history or their place in history, but they tend to exaggerate their contributions to Australian economic policy. I really did get a feeling that some people had done this in the book. There was one person mentioned, who I won't mention his name, you'll have to buy one of Alex's books, that seems to think that he was the centre of everything exciting that happened in Australian economic policy. So I think when you're writing something like this, when you're interviewing people and getting their reflections, you have to be very careful that it's not self-serving. But having made those provocative comments, which is what Alex would have wanted me to do, I've got to congratulate Alex on a very nice book to read, a very enjoyable book to read, a valuable contribution to our understanding of Australasian economic thought.
Our next panellist is William Coleman, Reader in Economics at Australian National University. Now, William has written, like John, on a wide variety of topics, now in macroeconomics, international trade, a whole lot of policy issues, as well as at least two really good books on aspects of the history of economic thought. So William, particularly with his expertise, with his recent writing on the history of Australian economics, I think is really well qualified to comment on Alex's book. William.
Thank you, Paul, for that kind introduction of the opportunity to participate in this valuable session. I am unwittingly, I see, the counsel for the defence. So let me begin by conceding one point of agreement with John. One which I'll mention, and that is, you're quite right, it is a Melbourne-centric book. It's not because the archives are there, it is because Melbourne has a sense that it is the leader. Okay. But let me now turn to a more positive note about Alex's work. The first point I'd like to press is that no one knows more about Australian economics than Alex, despite the fierce, indeed awe-inspiring competition of Crawford Goodwin, Peter Groenewegen and Bruce McFarlane. The text, one proof of that is the text of the book, to me appears to bear an infinite density. It's like a Mandelbrot zoom. You just keep on going into it, but the information just doesn't stop pouring out of it. And the book then is a scholar's work, and Alex certainly deserves every scholar's congratulation. A culmination of 3 decades which Alex has spent researching Australian economics and in service of the history of Australian economics, particularly as president of the History of Economic Thought Society of Australia, which will, let me say parenthetically, have its conference in Canberra on the 25th of September. Alex, then, is the historian's historian. But in saying that, I don't wish to convey to any member of the audience that the ballast of his book is dry detail. On the contrary, it conveys an almost intimate knowledge, personal knowledge of his subject matter. And that's doubtly sourced in his very effective mining of the correspondence, the personal correspondence of so many of the protagonists. Indeed, in reading this book, it appears to have been authored by a fabulously informed memoirist who managed to live from 1925 to the year 2000, rather than by a retrospective historian. And the near loquacity of the prose will certainly be a winning feature to any reader. Having said that, I do wonder what the general reader would make of it. Indeed, what, say, an economics or finance journalist would make of it, or indeed what the average economist, if you can think of such a thing, would say about it. I think they would be frustrated by the relevant lack or opacity of a narrative arc. So, let me ask the question, what is Alex's book all about? What has it achieved? Well, I think there are 3 possible achievements which such a book could perform. It could be a history of the contributions to the academic corpus of economics by Australian economists. And I think this is the kind of contribution, the kind of history that John had in mind. It could catalogue all those contributions. Possibly the Phillips curve is the most spectacular such contribution. A New Zealander. Though I should note that Leslie Melville had very definitely anticipated Phillips's conclusions in an earlier issue of the Economic Record. So it could do that. I wonder if it should have done that. I'm inclined to think that it's a good thing that it didn't do that. Such a book would be almanacal in flavour rather than a history. And further, I wonder if it would just be a bit silly. One could, in the same way, write a history of Southern Hemisphere economics, right? Cataloguing all the contributions by those who've been resident in the Southern Hemisphere to economics, or indeed a history of New South Wales economics. Again, cataloguing all the contributions of those resident in New South Wales to the corpus of economics. I just don't think it would be a very intelligent exercise. A second possible achievement, it could record the history of the public existence of economics in Australia. Pretty much the history of the Australasian economist in public life, or indeed the history of Australasian economic policy thought. And I think that, in large measure, is what Alex is trying to set out to do. The third possibility is that it could be a history of Australian economics as distinct from a history of economics in Australia. Now, here I need to pause to make a distinction. How is it that Australian economics would differ from economics in Australia? What would be the distinction? Well, at one extreme, an Australian economics could amount to the fanciful notion that there was some sort of indigenous growth within Australia that yielded an alternative paradigm of economics, rather like or in parallel with the German historical school of economics or the Austrian school of economics. All those were fairly indigenous growths within those two countries respectively, which amounted to alternative paradigms. As I said, or as I suggested, that would be a fanciful notion. If Australian economics is to be something real, as apart from myth or delusion, Australian economics would amount to the perception or the sensibility that the Australian economy constitutes some special case of a general theory. Okay, I think that is what the best hope for an Australian economics would be, and a history of Australian economics would recount the attempt to develop that special case of the general theory. If to make this notion a bit more palpable, one could refer to the peculiar institutions which have so long dominated Australia in the 20th century. Tribunal-determined wage rates, fiscal equalisation coinciding with acute vertical fiscal imbalance. More recently, our very singular superannuation scheme, Medicare. Maybe that's getting warm to the notion, but probably that is really referring to applications of a general theory, not a special case of a general theory. I think the best example of the notion which I'm advancing of Australian economics would come with respect to our macroeconomy, which is a special macroeconomy. It is, to put briefly, an open economy underpinned by exports of natural resources, coexisting at the same time with a very large non-tradable sector, both of which are sustained directly or indirectly by persistent capital inflows. This is our macroeconomy. And you can see in Alex's book and in the history of Australian economics more generally, 60 years, perhaps 70 years of struggling to analyse such an economy, beginning with the Brigden Report in late 20s, going on to the Giblin multiplier, which was so different from the Keynesian multiplier, and a difference which we see manifested in Brigden in the late 1930s, resisting Keynesian economics. How could we have an investment problem, saving problem in Australia, he said. Has there been a single year in the history of this country where investment has not exceeded saving on account of capital inflow? Going on, the struggle with this problem would go on to include Roland Wilson's efforts to incorporate non-tradables into the determination of the prices of tradables, Trevor Swan's more macroeconomic applications of that notion, and then in the 70s, Gregory and Corden and the whole Gregory thesis. And more recently in the economic, I see that Jörg Weber and a co-author has attempted to package that whole corpus into a single analytical framework. So that, I suggest, is what the closest thing we get to Australian economics. And Alex, I think, has done reasonable service in narrating that. What I want to observe, though, is that the sensibility that underlay that 60 years in an attempt to develop Australian macroeconomics as a special case of a general theory, that sensibility is now extinct. Okay. A generation ago, in 1980, Paul Krugman observed that the small open economy in North American universities was neglected. It was a topic which usually left to a Canadian or an Australian, he said. Small open people, we call them. All Aussies are good international trade. another editor of the International Journal of International Economics opined 30 years ago. Who would say that today? Right? You ask the average recruit over the past 10, 15 years, what's your topic? Game theory. What, do you do anything else? Oh, industrial organisation. I mean, these are the perpetual topics of the graduates over the past 15 years into Australian universities. Therefore, I want to suggest that what is, to me, is most interesting about Alex's book, The History of Australian Economics, it is an historical episode. And therefore, the book rightly has something elegiac about it, or melancholy, as Alex put it. Shall we really be so melancholy? Does it matter so much? Well, I think it does matter somewhat. I think it does matter a bit. Could we do anything about it? Well, that's more doubtful. I think Australian economics is firstly a casualty of globalisation. We know the benefits of globalisation. As economists, indeed, as practising economists, we know the benefits, but it has its costs. Firstly, it's imparted to so many of the well-placed persons within Australian economics what I would call a spectatorial consciousness. Of course, they don't see themselves that way, but I think that, in fact, it is a spectatorial consciousness, which is closely akin to what I would define as provincialism. I'll say that again, provincialism. Not the grappling with the big universal problems of the world, but provincialism. Why do I say provincialism? Well, John Stuart Mill once asked rhetorically, what is it that makes Norwich a provincial town? Because no novel can succeed in Norwich which has not been approved of by critics in London. And every novel which is disapproved of by critics in London will fail in Norwich. In other words, Norwich borrows its judgments of evaluation from London. And this is what we see today in Australian economics. The most palpable manifestation of that is the acute veneration of the A-Star Journal. And the trouble with that is, of course, is who runs the A-Star journals. It's, of course, largely American. And as one economist from the University of Chicago said, who cares about Australia? Indeed, who does care about Australia? The second reason which has made Australian economics an historical episode, a piece of history, is that it seems that economics today is either theory without facts or facts without theory, I'm afraid to say. And the kind of Australian economics that I was suggesting is in fact a conjunction of fact and theory, the general with the special. And that really has no space in this world of either theory without facts or facts without theory. So I would like to simply close by expressing my view again that it is a wonderful piece of workmanship, which I congratulate you on, Alex, and just joining you in your somewhat elegiac tone. Thanks.
Thanks, William. Following two, in fact, three experts on Australian economics, I'd like to offer now some brief reflections as, I guess, an interested outsider in the field of the history of Australian economics. A few things that struck me about the work. You know, the opening, as Alex kind of alluded to, and I think tried to explain, or perhaps jokingly explained us due to his Celtic ancestry, was the dark, tone which begins and ends the book, and pervades certain other bits of the book. He opens with the story of Badgett and nobody ever lamenting the death of a political economist, and then rapidly follows that with stories of 6 more deaths, and we haven't even got past the preface, and there's already dead bodies everywhere. And then we get the introduction, and there's the account of Giblin's death. So there's a certain darkness which pervades the book, and it's picked up in the final chapter, which I think, although John lamented that there wasn't a chapter on post year 2000 developments, I think in Alex's last chapter there is quite a bit of intimation of some of the things which Alex has talked about in some of the journal articles about contemporary economics. I think they're coming out in that last chapter on the period in the late 90s. I mean, Alex is a history. It's a good story. It's elegantly written, as John and William have observed. But he is making some historical arguments. Now, he is implicitly assuming, and William has criticised that view of there being something distinct about Australian economics. Alex is identifying it as Australian economics as being characterised by two things, as I read the book: a general distrust of markets and competition, and this practical concern, a preference for practical over theoretical matters. Now, of course, it's debatable. I think, as John has observed, the first of those, a distrust of markets and competition, is probably more properly described as a characteristic of Australian economic policy making rather than a characteristic of Australian academic economics in itself. Although Alex does make the argument right through the book about this close connection between Australian economic thought and Australian economic policy. So he is, amidst the good story, making some historical arguments about the distinct nature and the evolution of Australian economic thought. Some other things in the main part of the book which I found particularly interesting. There's good stories about Colin Clark and Trevor Swan and Nugget Coombs and lots of other names that you can read if you buy the book. He's got as has been observed, he's spent a lot of time in the archives, and there's a bit of dirt and gossip in various parts of the book. Not too much; it's all clean, but it's very, very interesting stories about individuals and incidents. I particularly enjoyed some of the background story of the Brain-Dixon squabble and some of the debates over economic modelling in Melbourne in the 70s and 80s. The role of visitors to Australia. It's remarkable, chapter after chapter, the way new directions in Australian economics have been provoked by people who've come out usually from England to spend a year or so in Australia. Some have stayed. He's mentioned Colin Clark, and I eagerly await his book on Colin Clark. That will be really important and interesting. But the role of visitors, the role of European emigres in the post-war period in stimulating Australian economics, also very, very interesting. There's a couple of things I was going to say, but I want to leave time for discussion. I might just draw together with something in evaluation. I think it is engagingly written. It's a good story. I did put it down a couple of times, but it really does flow along beautifully. It's a well-written book. It's full of interesting anecdotes. And I think there's some really astute observations about some critical incidents in the history of economics, particularly I think his account of Gibbon's multiplier and its relationship to work that was done in England, I think is really, really wise and seems to me pretty right. There were some frustrations about particular incidents. Alex did observe it's lightly written, but a book that is lightly written is going to gloss over theoretical developments. And I guess with my own background being in international trade, I was really wanting a bit more clarity and a bit more depth, I guess, around the discussion of the Brigden report and its analytical relationship to the Stopler-Samuelson theorem, and also of Wilson's work. and some of the details of those, what he calls the Australian model contributions. So I think the light touch gives the book certain advantages, but it does also leave us with certain frustrations and shortcomings at various places. A real strength of the book is the way he weaves together the story of Australian economic thinking and Australian economic institutions. The Economic Society is prominent in the book, but also institutions like the Reserve Bank and the Treasury and some of the other economic policy making institutions. That's a great strength of the book. So I think William's contribution is large. It's a very different book to Crawford Goodwin's book. It's a very different book, even to the Grunewagen and McFarlane book. But it's a valuable contribution, a historical contribution. It's also a book which I think will be widely read and enjoyed, and I think improve people's understanding and a fairly wide audience's understanding of the history of Australian economics, of where this debate about where economics in Australia is going. I think it'll be a really useful, valuable background against which we can have some of these debates about where we're going in Australia. So I'll leave it there and open it up for discussion. So we should have a microphone floating around. Thanks, Michael.
Thank you very much. Paul Dalzell from New Zealand. I thoroughly enjoyed the presentation. Can I make just 4 comments in response to some of the things you said? The first is that the Moniac machine at the Reserve Bank is a properly restored original Moniac. They did have to replace the electronics for safety reasons in case there were unexpected leakages from the income flow, but it is an original. The second thing, the question about how did Keynesian come to New Zealand, I think Conrad Blythe would be a key figure in that story. He was a graduate from the University of Otago who went to Cambridge where he did his PhD and then came back as the founding director of the NZ Institute of Economic Research, which, as you rightly say, was very influential during that period. And then he went to the University of Auckland, where he was Professor of Economics and head of department for a long time after 1972. The third point was you asked about whether it was the academics or the bureaucrats who were driving those. That distinction in New Zealand doesn't make a lot of sense because the debate was between the Auckland School, the professors and their students now in the civil service in Wellington, and the Victorian and Canterbury School with their students in the civil service in Wellington. And Conrad Blythe was the Keynesian side, and the neoliberal side was Lou Evans at Victoria and Richard Manning at the University of Canterbury. Finally, in terms of themes, I wonder if you thought about the Australia-New Zealand Closer Economic Relations Trade Agreement, which was the thin edge of the wedge that opened up the economic reforms in New Zealand in 1984. And Sir Frank Holmes was the colossus in convincing Robert Muldoon that he might experiment with some trade liberalisation with our Australian cousins. And Sir Frank Holmes was invited to speak at the Economic Summit Conference at the beginning of the reforms, where he was distinguished for giving the only joke over the full 3 days. And that joke was, if all the economists in New Zealand were laid end to end over the Cook Strait, most New Zealanders would think that a very good idea.
Good, thanks.
Thanks. No,
It seemed like more observations than questions.
I wish I had that material before I wrote the book, but the book's finished. There's nothing I can do. There won't be a revised edition, I'm pretty sure of it. Anyone else?
Other questions?
Philip Norman, the two countries had markedly contrasting successes or lack of successes in the 30s, and to what extent was the Australians pulling above their weight, or the New Zealanders struggling with parochialism? Oh, sorry, and I'd also like to second that the nonsense of the A-star journals. Thank you.
Well, I think Australian economists had a very heroic role in the 1930s, whereas the New Zealand economists, how would you see their role? Paul? they were fairly they're more orthodox, and well, so were Australian economists fairly orthodox. Going back to Paul's point, though, but I did mention Blythe and Holmes, but it wasn't explicit how Blythe was changing, or the economists were actually putting Keynesian economics in place. I mean, I was just struck by a dearth of literature looking at New Zealand in that Keynesian episode, which is always something that's my favourite topic. But it's implicit more than explicit. But as regards your first point, Philip, but I mean, I've wrote my PhD on the origins of macroeconomic management. It's a tribute to Copeland and Giblin in the 30s, and the practical utopia of economics. And that's a much more upbeat book. Much more upbeat book. The thing about what Paul said about being macabre, being elegiac or melancholy, I mean, it was only an idea I got about, because I know a lot of economists that are actually getting very old, and you think, well, will people write an obituary of them, or they just fade away? Like, remember what MacArthur said. So it's a tribute to them.
One suggestion is that you, after the Colin Clark book, you then publish your own PhD.
It's already published. The Colin Clark book, I'm thinking of calling it Hellraiser. So I discovered something about Colin Clark which I think could astound world economics. Someone who's doing some research for me found that there was two Colin Clarks. There's Colin Clark's The Economist, but there was another Colin Clark who was a film director, and he worked on Laurence Olivier and Marilyn Monroe's film called The Prince and the Showgirl. And in the index, he's only got one entry to Colin Clark. So I deduced from this that the Colin Clark was the movie director, had a 7-day affair with Marilyn Monroe. So I thought, oh, well, is he deducing that Colin Clark, the economist, had an affair with Marilyn Monroe? Now that could be a way to sell this next book. And it would be called The Economist and the Showgirl. Colin Clark's 7-day dalliance with Marilyn Monroe.
Brendan Markatelli, University of Queensland. This is a purely self-serving question. Sometimes I feel like I'm just about the only Australian economist left in a university. So I'm wondering what lessons, if any, would you be able to draw, Alex, from the history of Australasian thought that would offer advice to young Australian economists wanting to make distinctly Australian contributions to economics?
Well, one reason why I stopped the book at 2000, I didn't want to go into that ERA stuff about, how research is now aimed at American-orientated journals. And the session this morning talking about the future of the Australian economics profession, I mean, I could have talked about how it's a bit like the Premier League, the GO8s, and you hire these stars to score goals. And so Australian economic research is no longer... well, you might publish on Australian research, but it's very hard to land it in an American journal, an A-star journal. And I wrote an article of that with Anita Dorasamy. It was published last year. But I didn't want to go into that. And I thought 2000 was the best point. Firstly, because of word limitations. Secondly, there was too much more material changing. The Australian economics profession today is no longer Anglo-Saxon, obviously. But Crawford Goodwin said that was a good thing anyway. And I thought, well... And it was all part of that internationalization process anyway. So this is more an Australasian economist, native born, and the fact that they stayed in their country. Yeah, and to some extent, they stayed in their country to their detriment. Colin Clark, for instance, the Swedish Academy, the Nobel, they were unaware that Colin Clark was still living when they gave the gong to Richard Stone, his student.
He was just living in Queensland.
He was living in Queensland. He was down under, out of sight. Trevor Swan, his article on economic growth was published in Economic Records. It's only got 1,500 citations. The equivalent article by Solos got 20,000 citations. It won him the Nobel Prize for growth theory, amongst other things. So by coming here, or by emigre economists coming here, or any Australian economist staying here, you damaged your long-term career aspirations to some extent.
Now there's a comment from William.
It was just that Crawford Goodwin, however, rejected internationalised economics for Australia. He said, actually, rather contrary to your presumptions, John, that Australia would always be a footnote, right, in the history of economics, if we're thinking about the contribution to a general economics. And therefore, he presented this vision of an Australian economics somehow being a European country in Asia. Remember his article to that effect? So I guess that's just one, I don't know how close that is to economics, actually, but it is, I guess it's an attempt to look for the special case in the general theory.
Any other questions?
Okay, well, we might close there then, and I'll finish with an ad that all four of us are members of the History of Economic Thought Society of Australia. In fact, a society which Alex is president of, as was observed earlier. So if you're interested in the history of economic thought, if your interest is stimulated by this session, then have a look on the web, the History of Economic Thought Society of Australia. William Coleman is the convener of the conference this year in September in Canberra. So have a look at the History of Economic Thought Society. Think about coming along to the conference. So thanks for your attendance and enjoy afternoon tea.